Hi. In the Chaos of Cults by Karel von Baalen. Now we start the chapter on Christian Science. There is an abundance of incontestable evidence that the author of the religio-medico cult known as Christian Science was to the end of her 89-year life beset with maladies of both mind and body, that she was in her concluding years, through fear of death, subject to bondage, and that throughout she remained as self-centered as the cult which she had propagated. She claimed for herself, however, such divine inspiration and godlikeness as to make her assertions appear utterly incompatible with the impression she made upon the majority of her contemporaries. And since her followers have deified both her personality and her teachings, it is almost necessary for them to erase the picture of Mrs. Eddy left behind by those who lived in her own time. In this assiduous effort, time, as might be expected, has proved to be on the side of the committees on publication that have been organized in every state and province where Christian Science has gained a footing. The earlier works, written by contemporaries of the founder, are now mostly out of print. Large quantities of obnoxious literature have been collected and destroyed. The life of Mrs. Eddy has been rewritten, and whatever has been considered unfriendly has promptly been set aside as not authentic. There you see a parallel with, of course, Jehovah's Witnesses and their erasure of their own history. In an effort to practice their claim that Christian Science is a religion that strictly adheres to the Golden Rule, Christian Scientists send, free of charge, approved literature to those who have written adversely on Eddyism, and they courteously request such writers to change their appraisal in consonance with said literature. This has been the experience of Charles S. Braden, F.E. Mayer, Lloyd M. Wallach, and lately of the present writer. But none of these writers have changed their estimate of Christian Science or its author as a result of such correspondence. Miss Milmine's The Life of Mary Baker Eddy and the History of Christian Science, that was published in 1909, remains the fruit of such painstaking efforts and so much traveling through cities in which Mrs. Eddy lived, and contains so many sworn affidavits that it is impossible to set all this aside as negligible. And Mr. Dakin's biography, Mrs. Eddy, The Biography of a Virginal Mind, published in 1929, is so well documented that it cannot be ignored. Of this bestseller, such outstanding and unbiased reviewers as R.L. Duffus in the New York Times, and Haywood Brown, Book of the Month Club, H.L. Mencken in the American Mercury, spoke with the highest regard. Gilbert Seldes in the New York Herald Tribune wrote, "The decency of the author's attitude, his fine judgment, his poise, and his common sense make his work entirely praiseworthy." And Lewis Mumford stated in the New Republic, "Mr. Dakin has committed an unforgivable offense against Mrs. Eddy. He has done her justice." Christian Science statements that this scholarly standard work has been written without dependable data, official efforts to boycott and to suppress the sale of the book, and later assertions that these efforts were only of a few hypersensitive enthusiasts and therefore not very convincing. Moreover, because of the officially recommended biographies of Mrs. Eddy present a palpably one-sided portrayal in the interests of glorifying the founder, they cannot be relied upon as historical material. Perhaps it will be most charitable to conclude this painful introduction to our subject with the following two remarks. First, it is no doubt difficult to take a totally unbiased view of a person by whose teachings one has greatly benefited, and few, if any, will deny that Mrs. Eddy's teachings have been beneficial to some who take the grain of truth in the bushel of error which is the system of Eddyism. And secondly, when Mrs. Eddy's own experience so violently contradicted her teachings, is it any wonder that the truth is sometimes stretched or even distorted in order to make the facts tally with the firmly believed theory? Now he gets into a subhead, Stubborn Facts. When all the evidence is in, this much is beyond dispute. Mrs. Eddy, born July 16, 1821, at Bow, New Hampshire, suffered much from a spinal weakness which affected her physically as well as mentally. This lasted well into her earlier womanhood and marred her first and second marriages. Her troubles caused her to visit the then famous P.P. Quimby at Portland, Maine, who followed in the footsteps of the Frenchman Charles Poyen, a noted mesmerist. Twice, Mrs. Eddy, then known as Mrs. Patterson, visited Quimby. She spent considerable time with him in private and discussed his teachings and methods. After her visit, she would sit for hours to write down her conclusions. This has given rise to many confusing reports. Some hold that Mrs. Eddy's Bible, Science and Health, first published in 1875, contains many of these notes and/or embodies material taken home from Quimby. But Mrs. Eddy maintained that her book was the result of direct divine inspiration, and that it differed radically from Quimby's findings. Christian Scientists, of course, believe Mrs. Eddy. Miss Wilbur has gone so far as to state that there never were any Quimby manuscripts, but reprints of official documents and affidavits disprove this theory. It remains an undeniable fact that Mrs. Eddy was at first eloquent in her praise of Dr. Quimby. She said, "He heals the sick as Jesus did." She continually dinned into the ears of people, "I learned this from Dr. Quimby," and that as time went on, she gradually denounced not merely the source of her theories, but pronounced the man she had at first eulogized a mere mesmerist, whereas she advocated healing through the mind. We may pass by in silence such questions as, in how far was Mrs. Eddy prompted by selfish motives? Was she herself ever healed of any organic trouble? Why was it that she, the divinely inspired prophetess of a new Bible, kept on revising her book throughout the years? What plausible explanation may be given for the fact that the later revised editions contained a far purer and grammatically more correct English than the earlier ones? Certainly we cannot take seriously her own explanation that she was so inspired with divine science when she wrote the first edition that grammar was eclipsed. Why do even the later editions of Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures leave the impression of terrible confusion upon intelligent readers, both as to the arrangement and rearrangement of chapters and their failure to limit themselves to their subjects? Christian Scientists have always indignantly objected to the fact that New York newsmen attempted to obtain an interview with Mrs. Eddy during her declining years at Chestnut Hill. They have boldly denied the almost identical assertions by 9 of the newsmen that after heroic attempts to get near her, they found the aging woman in a tottering condition, both physically and mentally. Christian Scientists should, however, remember that Mrs. Eddy had for many years denied the reality of sickness and death. Her entire system depended utterly upon the demonstration of the correctness of these denials. Consequently, rumors that Mrs. Eddy herself was making frantic but fruitless efforts to prove that correctness in the face of increasing weakness and approaching death more than warranted an honest attempt to inform the public at large of what was going on in and around Chestnut Hill. Was it true that Mrs. Sargent doubled for Mrs. Eddy during her daily rides in her brougham, because Mrs. Eddy was camouflaging her own deteriorating physical condition? True it is that Mrs. Eddy, on December 2nd, 1910, at the age of 89.5 years, died as all have done before her, in spite of her teaching that God is all, God is life, and therefore sickness and death are non-existent. Next time, therapeutic fruits of Christian Science. Put in a link to something similar, parallel to all that we've just read, which is what the Russellites did with N.H. Barber, one of their principal sources, the man with whom their founder, Charles Taze Russell, had written the book that was the kind of the prelude to the Watchtower, that is the book 3 Worlds in 1877. What the Russellites did with him is demonize him. Not surprisingly, then N.H. Barber has become the wicked servant by the time the finished mystery is written. See you next time.